Hello again, Psych 370 students, and welcome to your second video lecture for week 15. In my first video lecture for this week, I said a few introductory things about observational learning, right? So for example, I went over the concepts of vicarious reinforcement and vicarious punishment. I also talked about some research demonstrating that observational learning occurs not only in humans, but in other species too. But guys, the thing is, not everything that looks like observational learning actually qualifies as true observational learning. There are a few other forms of social influence that sometimes get mistaken for observational learning. So in this video lecture, which is part of a Zoom class from last year, I'll be going over some of those other forms of social influence and contrasting them with observational learning. First of all, there's something called social facilitation, which you guys might have heard of before, but just in case you haven't, social facilitation is a pretty basic form of social influence where the mere presence of other people affects how well or how poorly we perform a particular task. So the reason we call it social facilitation is because in social situations, when you're with other people, when you're in the presence of other people, your most likely behavior, your most likely performance, what we often call your dominant response, gets facilitated. It becomes even more likely to occur or even more pronounced when it does occur. Okay, so the facilitation of your dominant response due to the presence of other people, that's social facilitation. Okay. And so, guys, what that means is that the presence of other people can cause your performance to go in either direction, right? It depends on the task. So if it's a simple task, or if it's something that you've had a lot of practice with so that you're really good at it, then you'll probably perform that task even better when other people are around, right? So on easy or well-learned tasks like those, your dominant response is good performance, right? So the presence of other people are going to tend to facilitate that good performance and make it even better. But if the task is hard, or if it's something you haven't had much practice with so that you're not very good at it, then you'll tend to do that even worse when other people are around. Again, your dominant, most likely behavior on a task like that would be poor performance. So when you have to perform that task in front of other people, they will facilitate that poor performance, right? They'll facilitate that tendency that you have to perform that task poorly. And so you'll probably perform the task even worse. Okay. So guys, that's what social facilitation is all about. It's basically where you do better at stuff you're good at and worse at stuff you suck at due to the presence of other people. Yeah. And this is a pretty well established phenomenon. There's been a lot of interesting research on social facilitation. So for example, in one study, what the researchers did first was they observed people from a distance, okay, as they shot pool in a student union. They did that so that they could categorize each player as a novice or an expert at pool, okay? And then once they had done that, they sent four confederates, four actors basically, over to each table and they had them watch each player, okay? So now the players have an audience, right? And they knew it too. I mean, the Confederates stood close enough to the pool tables that it was obvious that they were watching. And as you can see in the graph here, the expert players shot even better when they had an audience. They went from 71% of their shots made alone to 80% with people watching. But the novice players did worse when other people were watching. So again, they're novices at first. It's a difficult task for them anyway. They only made 36% of their shots when they were alone. But when they had the presence of other people, when other people were watching them, those other people sort of facilitated that tendency to perform poorly, right? So that those novices only made 25% of their shots with the audience. Okay. So that's a good example of social facilitation. Another good example is that people will type their names more quickly in front of a group than they will alone. But if you ask them to type their name backwards, then they do that faster alone than they do in the presence of other people because they never do that, right? Typing your name backwards is a poorly practiced task. It's not something you do a lot. So in the presence of other people, you tend to do it even worse than you would alone. And guys, one more finding that I want to share with you here is that social facilitation has even been demonstrated in cockroaches. Okay, so for example, a psychologist named Robert Zients did a study once where he measured how quickly cockroaches ran away from a floodlight, okay, into the safety of one of these gold boxes. And he had him do it either alone or with other roaches watching. Okay, so there were these audience boxes built into the apparatus, and sometimes other roaches were in there, other times they weren't. And he found that if the task was simple, if the roaches only had to run in a straight line, then they did better in the audience condition. Okay, they did better with other roaches watching. But if he made the task more difficult, if he made it a bit more complex, so that they had to make a turn, then the roaches did better. They escaped more quickly when they did the task alone than they did when they had an audience. Okay, so that's another good example here of social facilitation. So anyway, social facilitation is interesting, and it refers to, again, how the mere presence of other people can affect our behavior. But guys, the reason this doesn't count as observational learning is because, for one thing, even though there is a change in behavior, it's not a lasting change, right? So it's not like the expert pool players got permanently better or the novice players got permanently worse just from being watched like that. Okay, so it's just a temporary change in performance. And for another thing, with social facilitation, it's just the presence of other people that influences us. They don't have to do anything in particular in order for those social facilitation effects to occur. So again, observational learning is where we actually learn, right? Our behavioral potential actually changes because we observe an event and its consequences. And social facilitation is an interesting and somewhat related phenomenon, but because it doesn't result in a lasting change, and because those other people who are present don't have to do anything in particular to produce that change in performance, it doesn't quite live up to this definition of observational learning. Yeah. It's a form of social influence, but that doesn't make it a form of observational learning. Now, another phenomenon, another form of social influence that is similar to, but not quite the same thing as observational learning, is what's sometimes called contagious behavior. Okay, call it contagious behavior. And I'm sure you've experienced this before. So, for example, let's say that you're studying late one night with a group of your friends. And as you're studying, or maybe as you're talking about the material, you notice one of your friends yawning. Okay, so you observe that behavior. You look over and you see your friend yawn. Okay. Now, what do you think you're especially likely to do after you see that? Probably to yawn, right? You're probably going to yawn. So, yeah, imitative yawning like that is probably one of the best examples that I could give you of a behavior spreading contagiously like that. It's one of the best examples of contagious behavior that I could give you. Or allelomimesis, I guess, as it's also known. I guess that's what you'd call it in an academic context. If you want other people to really think you know what you're talking about, you'd call it allelomimesis, right? So that they'll go, oh, better listen to what this guy has to say. Throwing around words like allelomimesis, right? But either, whatever you want to call it, you're talking about this phenomenon where a particular behavior can be elicited just by observing the same behavior in someone else. Yeah. So I want to show you guys a quick video here of contagious behavior, or allelomimesis, in action. Okay, so they record this first chimp yawning. All right. Now they're going to show that video to a second chimp. And there you go. Second chimp yawns too. Right. So anyway, yawning is a great example of a behavior that's often contagious. Fear responses are often contagious too. For example, all it really takes to get a flock of ducks off and flying is one startled duck. Okay. Once one duck takes off like that, the others tend to follow suit. That behavior spreads sort of contagiously throughout the entire flock. And orienting responses. We already talked about laughing. Orienting responses. Oh, no, I haven't talked about laughing. Laughter is often contagious. Okay. That's why TV shows often have laugh tracks in them, right? You're much more likely to laugh at something if somebody else is also laughing at it, because laughter can be contagious. It can spread like that. And orienting responses are also often quite contagious. So when one person in a group orients towards something, when they look at it suddenly, for example, other people tend to orient toward it too. If you don't believe me about that, then you could try this. The next time you're talking to somebody, quickly shift your gaze to something behind them or something to the side of them and see if they look where you look. Okay. Chances are they will, because again, orienting responses like yawning are often quite contagious. So this is another interesting phenomenon, contagious behavior. And it sort of looks like observational learning, right? Because you're observing someone else's behavior, it's affecting your own behavior. Right? And contagious behavior is an example of imitation because it involves you becoming more likely to perform a behavior that resembles the behavior of a model, as you'll read about in the textbook. That's how we define imitation. But the thing is, not all examples of imitation count as examples of observational learning. Okay. So, guys, I'm telling you about contagious behavior partly because I think you'll find it to be an interesting phenomenon, but mainly to contrast it with observational learning and help clarify what observational learning really is. So, remember, to go back to our definition of learning from way back earlier in the semester, we defined learning as a change in behavioral potential that occurs due to experience, right? That's learning. In observational learning, the experience is the observation of an event and its consequences. And as a result of that observation, you actually acquire a new behavior, right? You do something differently from that point forward. So there's this lasting change in how you do things. Right? But with contagious behavior, that doesn't happen, right? With it, you're not acquiring anything new, right? You're not learning a new behavior. There's no change to your behavioral potential with contagious behavior. You're just doing something that you already knew how to do, right? Something that was already in your behavioral potential, right? You're just becoming momentarily more likely to perform that behavior because you saw the same behavior being performed by someone else. So, guys, that's an important thing to keep in mind about observational learning. Many cases of observational learning do involve imitation. They involve us watching and imitating a model, right? Imitating a behavior that we probably never would have learned to perform if it weren't for the observation. But imitation and observational learning aren't exactly the same thing because, again, not all cases of imitation qualify as cases of actual learning through observation. So, contagious behavior is imitation. It does count as imitation, but it doesn't count as observational learning because there's no acquisition, right? There's no change in behavioral potential that occurs when we see contagious behavior. They're just performing a behavior that they had already learned how to perform. They're not acquiring or learning anything new. Yeah. So that's the distinction between contagious behavior and observational learning. Okay, well, that's a good place to stop this video lecture. Please let me know if you have any questions about these other types of social influence and how they differ from observational learning. And please also make sure that you check out my next video lecture too, in which I'll be going over the difference between what we call social versus asocial observational learning. Okay, take care, guys.